This is a discussion now. This isn't the coffee break. Can somebody close the doors, please? We are continuing the discussion. The coffee break is after this. Okay? All right. Can you please close the doors, someone over there at the end? Because we can't have a discussion with open doors and people having coffee. Thank you. Okay, so let me just jump straight into this panel, which is, Kelly, can you close the doors? Thank you. Yeah, well, you know, it's a lengthy day, so people will have to just come back. So this discussion, this panel is a way to dig deeper into what really underpins the discussion we had earlier. Okay, so we had competition agency leads discussing how they essentially live this reality politically of Draghi, Letta, the current predicament of Europe. But what's behind it is fundamentally the problem of growth, as we kind of concluded on. Without growth, there is no future for the European model. So what is the predicament we're in, and what are the solutions? So I have asked Rana, Foroohar, and Sander Toudoir to join this panel. They weren't on the original lineup, but Muriel is not well, and Jan is sick with flu, and so it's good to have their voices in here too. This is not emphatically a competition law panel, but that's good, because it does have a lot of foundation for the discussion that we need to have as in competition circles. So I don't need to spend more time talking because I want to hear from this great group. I think it's important to bear in mind the diagnosis that Draghi puts before us, which is, you know, China industrial policy on the one hand coming to unleash a second China shock on us, which is really now weighing heavily in Europe and really discombobulating Germany in ways that are extremely tough. I described it as the Detroit moment for Germany, and it is such. And then on the other hand, the US potentially imposing tariffs, and in any case already sort of shrinking its share of European imports. In all of this, we're sitting in the middle, and then there is a discussion of what should Europe do. So one of the current areas of discussion is, or focus for discussion, is a report that has recently come out from the Center for Economic Reform. Sander Toudoir is the chief economist and has made a number of suggestions as to what Germany in particular should do, but given that Germany is the beating industrial heart of Europe, we need to listen. And then I would like, rather than me trying to describe the solutions proposed by Sander and Brad Setzer, I should add, it's better if you just briefly highlight the points, and then I will ask Luis Garicano to give his view on that. Please, Sander, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristina. Can I take just 1 second to lay out the analysis, because I think it helps to set the debate. So Germany just confirmed its second year of recession. Industrial production in the EU's largest economy has been declining for 5 years. And that is clearly leading to some existential angst in a country where manufacturing is still 20% of GDP, and there are 5.5 million manufacturing jobs, which is roughly as many as there are tech jobs in the US, to give you a sense of the scale. China just clocked a $1 trillion trade surplus, a $2 trillion trade surplus in manufactured goods, which is 10% of its GDP. To give you a sense of the scale of that, the US during World War I, when Europe's factories were not exporting but building weapons, had a trade surplus in manufactured goods of 6%. So China's is almost double that. I think it's now clear for Germany that China's new industrial structure focused on clean tech, on automotive, on the aviation sector, on machine building, is directly competing with Germany's manufacturing foundation. And in some ways, this was well telegraphed. One of China's flagstone industrial policy projects is called the 10,000 Little Giants, and it specifically aims to replicate the entire German Mittelstand, all the small and medium-sized industrial companies that are actually the beating heart of German industry. But industrial policy alone wouldn't create such a huge trade surplus. There's clearly a macroeconomic dimension, which is that for a long time, China's property sector absorbed the country's savings. It basically masked that the country has had very low consumption for a long time. And since the property bubble burst, the Chinese government is putting all these excess savings in directed investment into these key sectors. So what has been the result? I mentioned already the trade surplus. China's exports are growing in volume terms, mind the deflation, in volume terms at 12% a year. Global trade is growing at 3%. Germany's exports are flat. In key good areas, they're shrinking. So these things are clearly intertwined. So what can Germany do about all of this? And what if they don't act? I mean, essentially, we think if they don't act, they will face very rapid deindustrialization with significant losses in productivity and employment in specific regions. And so Germany will really have to rethink its fiscal policies, its industrial policies, and its trade policies. And to borrow here from Henry Kissinger, Germany remains, as always, too large for Europe and too small for the world. And so they'll need a bit of help from their European friends. And we make a couple of suggestions. The first obvious tool to deploy is the EU's trade defense instruments. We've imposed EV tariffs on China. Not with German support, mind you, which I think shows you the risk of Germany not getting on with the program. And there should be ample scope to do WTO duties on Chinese goods given their pervasive subsidies. The second is a suggestion that we have is that to equip basically all the subsidy schemes that Europe has for heat pumps, for EVs, for other types of products with buy European clauses and buy ally clauses. That too should be feasible, and in fact you see now the Commission making a proposal to steer public procurement in Europe towards European products, which will be essential for German industry to have demand to survive China's distortions. And that's where competition comes in, because basically you can use the state aid framework to tell all the member states that they should design their subsidy schemes with the same conditions, with the same de facto buy European clauses, for example, that if it's an EV, it cannot be built with coal-fired power. It cannot be transported from too far away. You could also just write in buy European, but there are ways of doing that. And I think Lewis has made the point that it would create a mess in the single market. I would argue it's the opposite. Now we have all these different types of subsidy schemes. There's no coherence. And I think competition enforcers can play a key role basically in having a level playing field within Europe in that respect. And then finally, Germany probably should rethink its fiscal policies. Even if we put in place tariffs, even if we work with buy European clauses, offsetting the loss of export markets that Germany is currently experiencing will be very difficult. I mean, take cars, which is the tip of the Chinese spear. Germany's net car exports have declined by half in the last 4 years, by half, from 2 million to 1 million. China's net car exports have exploded from basically zero. They were not a net car exporter 4 years ago to 5 million now and still rising. So, I mean, the scale is quite staggering. So I don't think that Germany can basically funnel enough demand into its manufacturing sector, which still remains in many areas technologically very much at the frontier, without running a slightly looser fiscal policy and investing in public infrastructure, which is what they should have done a long time ago anyway. Thank you.
So I really wish people really took in this analysis. We'll talk about the cures because the analysis is so stark. I mean, think about the loss of export from Germany. It is massive, and I feel very threatened by this environment. Now, Sander and Brad outlined a number of possible solutions. Luis Garicano, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, before that he was a member of parliament, has a very popular blog and writes on economics. And your reaction to to what Sander and Brad have said has been, whoa, wait a minute. I may agree with the diagnosis, but I'm not on the same page on the cure. So please enlighten us on what you think.
Thank you. I'll profit the sales and marketing break to say that the block is called Silicon Continent. So is this
you're
working?
on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So yes. So first, just a little analytical start, and I agree with Cristina and with Sander that I mean on the existence of the shock, the second China shock, the risks that we're incurring. I think this is very well illustrated and explained by Sander and Brad in that CR report that I recommend you all to read. Analytically, just first let me say that there is a lot of discussion on industrial policy that I think is misguided in terms of how it's framed. I think most economists actually agree on industrial policy in terms of what the pros and the cons are. In terms of, okay, if you have a coordination problem, if you have a public goods problem, if you have an externality problem, intervention of the state could be warranted. That's the pros, and the minuses is you're going to create you have a risk of cronyism and the corruption, and do you have the state capacity? Those are the three big minuses. So I think those 2 points are clear, and so the issue is when. It's not whether industrial policy is good or bad, but what is the balance of these two things, and when should we actually expect industrial policy to work? So my first plea is, let's stop the silly debate. Industrial policy works, oh, look at the Manhattan Project, or industrial policy doesn't work, look at Venezuela. Okay, that's silly. We know that it can work on some occasions, and it has failed on many occasions. And the main review of the literature, and I don't think it's a suspect of being too liberal or too free market, Danny Roderick et al., he argues, look, there are two basic findings that we get on industrial policy when we look at long historical experience. One is, it works when first condition, let losers fail. If industrial policy is about protecting previous bets, it's not going to work, okay? So, the first question is, are the conditions that we're looking at such that we can let losers fail? Second condition is have clear objectives, okay? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to develop this new industry? Are you going for security? Are you going for national security? What are you trying to do? If you don't have clear objectives, you're not going to achieve what you want because you don't know what you want. Now, my objections to the industrial policy plea on the report that we're discussing is, I don't think Europe at all is even nearly ready to let losers fail and to let, for example, think of electric vehicles and manufacturing of cars. The truth of the matter is, China had hundreds of new companies in electric vehicles, of which only a couple of 3 or 4 are making money. The US has had a few electric vehicles companies, well, several, of which 3 are actually doing pretty well. And Europe doesn't have any. There has not been any new electric vehicle company. Where is the German entrepreneur in his garage starting, or in her garage starting this new company? The whole approach has been about keeping the jobs of the people in those industries, which is a perfectly legitimate objective, but it's not an objective that's going to make you get a new export industry. So we don't have the ability to have industrial policy where people compete and at the end there is a winner, and that's on the contrary, there is going to be all this political economy, all these constraints, and we don't have single objectives. Nobody has any idea what we're trying to achieve. If you look at the typical Commission document, including yesterday's Compass, it has like security and environment and this and that. How are you going to make trade-offs if you have no idea what you want? So, the solutions. So, what are the solutions? So the solutions are my criticism of the report was, okay, too much of a belief in this industrial policy ability to really make these enlightened choices. And the second complaint I had, which, if you allow me, and I put it in the blog, so I guess I can say it in public, I called enshittification of the single market. And what I meant is, like the report says, look, this thing about rules of origin and favoring by European rules is kind of illegal. So let's stick it in all rules, and let competition authorities kind of enforce this kind of informally. So, for example, social, environmental pretexts to make things be hard to import and so on. competition authorities looking at and favoring local versus, I mean, that's just versus foreign is going to be very hard, and it's going to make us go in trouble with Japan, with Korea, with other places. So can we put some rules on where we're giving our subsidies? Maybe we can, okay? Maybe we shouldn't give all EVs subsidies, but maybe we should put some local content requirements. I'm not completely disagreeing with that suggestion. Here are my 4 main suggestions quickly. First, stop the self-inflicted wounds, okay? We have this absurd, I was in Parliament when some of these things were passed, okay? I can tell you some of these absurd radical deadlines have no costing behind. Nobody has any idea if 2035 is feasible. Somebody comes with this idea, the way these debates work is somebody comes with 2038, and then there is somebody, normally from the Green Party, but it could be from another place, saying, no, I am greener, it has to be earlier. And it's like, okay, have you thought about earlier? Like, okay, it's earlier, but 2030. So then we start discussing, all these people have no idea, all these lawyers, nobody has any idea whether it takes 2 years or 3 years or 7 years to get this, whatever. And people start kind of arguing about numbers. And then arguing about numbers is beautiful because everybody can have an opinion. You can say 2042 and you can say 2038, and both of you have no freaking idea. But you can be sure that you have an opinion. So,
but the council had a vote on it.
Yes.
The council is not coming up with that
Okay.
fantasy.
Okay, you'll be able to criticize me in a second. So my view is that those were arbitrary. Get rid of them. Get rid of them, okay? We have a system in Europe. We have a price system. We have incentives. We can actually steer people by raising the prices of carbon. It's a great, clean system. We don't have to give sticks in the head of citizens who want to rent their apartments, like in France. You're not allowed since the 1st of January to rent your G apartments because they're polluting. If you're a poor person, you're out of business, okay? Your house is never going to be insulated. You will not be able to rent it. And they're taking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of housing units out. Second, yes, public expenditure is necessary, but the states should do their job. I mean, public goods, like let's look about Germany. They don't have highways anymore. They don't have trains anymore. They don't have telecoms infrastructure anymore. And they don't have charging infrastructure. So instead of like dreaming these beautiful dreams, and you'll be happy to hit me hard. So I'm happy to hear. I can take it. So instead of dreaming these big dreams, let the state do their goddamn work. I mean, they need to do the job. Invest in those public things. Get the infrastructure going. Third, the subsidies, I discussed that. Fourth, I mean, I do think the bonfire of regulations has to happen. I do think that entrepreneurs, everything that was said in the competition panel before is true. Everything Draghi said before is true. We are putting a gigantic amount of obstacles in front of people actually trying to do better. And I am sorry to say, I don't believe the President of the Commission has what it takes to say, you know what, all these things we didn't do in those 5 years, that was really wrong, we need to undo it. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. And I hope she does it when she comes with this omnibus. But I have humongous doubts. I think it's going to be all kind of, well, it was all great, but let's just do a little bit less. So I think we need to do this bonfire of regulations, and I think that the Commission needs to do their job. The Commission has been very happy during all these years to play Mother Christmas, come with money to the States, be very popular, instead of like all the old Commission that was so mean with austerity. Now we are like bringing you money. And has stopped enforcing the single market. And this is their essential role. You need to fight with the states. Telcos. Why is telco not working? Is it because merger enforcement? No, it's because of politics. Governments want to have a telco operator that they control. In Spain, it has just become under state rule just a week ago. Why? Because the government loves that. They can control publicity, they can control the newspapers, etc. So that is the problem. That's where the Commission needs to intervene. Second, banks. Why do we have home and host regulations? Why are the banks still under local control after 10 years of the single supervisory mechanism? Because governments want to direct credit. It's very simple. Talk to anybody in private from any finance ministry and they will tell you, yes, we love when there's a crisis to call a bank and say, hey guys, you need to loosen the spigots, give more credit, or you need to buy our bonds. This is called moral suasion. It's not moral suasion, it's extortion. I mean, the government calls and says you buy those bonds. So that's what the Commission needs to do. We need a single market that works. We need a set of rules that allow entrepreneurship and dynamism. And we need to do the basic jobs before we dream of grandiose schemes.
Thank you. Well, you can see why I love this provocation from Luis. I think one of the observations that comes to mind, of course, is that when there's a change in administration in the US, because there's a new broom, everyone gets sacked, and new people get in quite brutally in place. In Europe, it's like, oh, we got this new plan for the next 5 years, but who was there 5 years? Oh, it's you. Oh, okay. Never mind. We're going to just believe you're going to change everything. Okay, that is perhaps a cheap joke, but let me move on to Johannes Lindner, who is, of course, director at the Delors Institute, but very steeped into the discussion, of course, of what's happening in Germany. And I'd like you to just react to what Sander and Luis have just said with your own views. Thank you.
Let me first start. It's great to be here, and also great to speak after Sander and Luis. And I'm probably in between both of you. What I fear is that the debate on industrial policy has become very polarized and politicized in a way that's not helpful. I think some of the people that very much subscribe to what you say would say, yeah, well, let only the market do it. But then, given that we are, of course, pushing up the price because we want to internalize some of the externalities, we have the same people saying, well, let's maybe postpone this. And many of the internalization mechanisms that we've come up with are actually not any more credible because they are then questioned. So in a way, the whole objective of green transition is very quickly then challenged altogether. And then even the price mechanism doesn't work any longer because the whole internalization system is questioned. So that's what I would say. And I would also say that in terms of because we're not able to do it, we should not do it is probably not the right conclusion. But before maybe I go and explain what Europe should do, let me just say one word on Germany. I've just arrived back from Berlin, and I wanted to say something about the sort of perfect storm title that you bring in. Because your question, in a way, what is the analysis in Germany, but it's also what's the leadership in Germany. And I think here I come in with really quite some pessimism. And I think the notion of perfect storm is a right one because I'm coming back at a situation where I think the political climate in Germany is rather tense at the moment. After the discussion we had last night and the vote we had last night, because it's very unclear where the German government is heading and what kind of German government we are getting, because if you think about an election outcome where none of the two bigger parties would have a coalition majority, could form a coalition, you would not have a majority to maybe review some of the debt brake and the possibility to spend money. You really have a stalemate in Germany. And you have a stalemate in Germany at a situation where you look over the Rhine, and in France there's also really a political stalemate. So the question of leadership, the question of this political situation in Germany, I think is a very dire one. And I think it's the first point I wanted to make because you asked me to look into Germany. The second point I want to make is why I think the issue of politicization or polarization of industrial policy is not helpful, because I think it's sometimes a bit too simplistic. And I think, Luis, when you started off, you were absolutely right. It's not about the question of whether we do industrial policy or not to do industrial policy, but to do it right. And I think some of the debate that I see in Germany is really too simplistic. So some of the center-right are basically saying it's all about debureaucratization and simplification. And then they look at Northvolt, they look at the Intel case, and so on, and basically say competitiveness can be regained simply by debureaucratizing and by, in a way, also lowering the focus on the green transition. At the same time, I think the center-left runs the risk of running into the trap that Garicano laid out, is like preserving Volkswagen jobs, saying that steel has to be kept in Germany at all cost, energy has to be subsidized. And I think what is important is to overcome that kind of polarization of the two camps. And I think to look into what can Europe really do. And I would personally say the competitive compass is a first step, but we're not there yet. And I think just very quickly, the 3 points I think we have to look at in a very pragmatic way. The first is we need to be selective. Industrial policy can make sense when there is market failure, but I think it does not make sense if we're not selective. And if I look at some of the Net Zero Industry Act, or if I take the CHIP Act and the STEP Act, you count all this together, we have 150 technologies that need to be supported. I mean, that's silly. That's not selective. Then I think the second point is we need to be sector-specific and have a good combination of the different instruments that we have at hand. And I think here Sander is absolutely right. We do have quite existing European regulation and trade policy instruments that we need to combine specifically for the sector that we are looking at. Be it the car industry with electric vehicles, be it also with some of the instruments that we have that still very much allow for competition. Look at the lead market idea. So you say you set standards for green steel that need to be complied with, and that allow the industry to see how they achieve these standards. You can have some of the rules on procurement, where Europe has a possibility to make that mandatory. Some of the permitting rights. I think so. So I think you can devise sector-specific strategies that work. And then the third is on funding. I mean, we here in the Jacques Delors Center and my colleagues Niels Redeker and Philipp Jäger have been working on that for quite a while. Originally have been thinking very much on what would be the ideal funding structure, and then saying, well, when the next MFF comes, then we will come up with the ideal setup. And I think we need to be pragmatic on that as well. One is, I think, in terms of allowing state aid to be relaxed. Some of the TCFA framework relaxation that we have, I think, have worked. In fact, some of the latest data we've looked at is that the risk of fragmentation for too activist state aid relaxation is actually not been not being confirmed by the data. I think the risk that we see too activist state aid support and that leads to fragmentation, we don't see, in fact. So in terms of that we see that national member states are too much supporting national champions. That the data it doesn't show so much, in fact. So I would be a bit more open to on the state aid front and to use the state aid in a kind of way as coordinating national. And the second point, but I almost even more importantly, is some of the European windows that we have. So the hydrogen bank, the battery fund, where you can actually give national money into a European window, and that's then auctioned off through Europe. And I think that's a way of relying on national funding, not waiting for European funding, but giving it that direction. But let me close with one last point, though, is that I would agree that all of this alone is not the solution. I think many of the things that we discussed in the first panel, that in fact we've also discussed last year, in terms of financial integration, in terms of also easing the conditions to do business, I think is equally important and needs to be part of the package. And I hope, and that's, started very pessimistically, but I hope a new German government would have that very much on the agenda as a package and would show leadership on that.
Wonderful. I love all these points and the way in which this is evolving. I particularly want to put an accent on, you say there's a risk of course there is a risk, more than a risk. This discussion is polarized to some extent with the sort of the more libertarian right sort of that thinks that all you need is deregulation and then the animal spirit will take over and the growth will happen by fiat. And in some sense, there is a view which is what I think Sander is putting forward and Draghi, that you need to combine this with actual spending. And then the question is, where is that spending coming from and what shape does it take and will it be effective? So let me move on to Rana as someone who, of course, is not a European but a close observer of these dynamics and writes frequently in the Financial Times about how we are approaching this. How does it all look to you?
Am I on? Yeah. Is this, yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. You know, I'm looking at the title of this panel, Manage Decline or Worse, and I'm going to go with worse. I'm also going to step back a bit, and I'll stay out of the weeds of the particulars of the Draghi report, the position paper that was put out this week by the EU. I agree generally with what Johannes said on industrial strategy. But let me just say, as an observer, as someone who lived kind of in the good old days, I guess, in Europe, 98 to 2007, and as someone that's watching very much what's happening from the US and what Europe will do as it's being attacked really from both sides, from the US and from China. I wrote a column a few weeks ago arguing that Europe was a bit like a well-dressed flaneur that's about to be attacked by a couple of thugs in the alley. And the attack is going to be the dumping of a lot of cheap stuff by China into Europe at a time when it is completely politically unprepared and unable to cope with it. And I think Sanders' report is really must reading on that score. The China shock is very real. And then on the other side, you have a new government in the US that is completely in bed with big tech. You might even argue being run by the techno-libertarians that are dreaming of a world with no government, dreaming of a world of surveillance capitalism, challenging the sovereignty of existing nations where they can. And where that's going to go is no place good. I think in that world, Europe has absolutely no choice but to think about its own resiliency, protecting its own values, and building its own capacity in strategic areas. And let me say a few words about that. I was a big fan, as many know, of what the Biden administration was trying to do, and I'm really pleased to have the chance to moderate the next panel and to have folks like Catherine Tai say a little bit more about what was trying to be achieved, because I think that Europe didn't completely get the message on that, and it wasn't given as clearly as it might have been. But there is a desperate need amidst concentrated power, be it in the state or be it in the form of big tech and Silicon Valley billionaires, for more capacity. Was it ever a good idea for 92% of all high-end semiconductors to be made in one island, Taiwan? No, probably not. Was it, yeah, that wasn't good for Europe, China, or the US. Was it good for supply chain capacity in critical areas to be so concentrated? Not really. That's what the Chicago-based market knows best system wrought, but that didn't account for things like the climate, for inclusivity, for sustainability, for jobs. And just, I want to pull back and share an anecdote actually from my third book, which I think was so telling, and it was the reason I wrote the book. I was speaking in the wake of some of the buildup of the US-China trade skirmishes in the last several years. I spoke to a labor leader in the US about the conversation that was being had as China was coming into the WTO, and as there was this assumption, very naive assumption, that a country like China, that large state-run capitalist societies would simply sort of happily come into the Bretton Woods system and all would be well. And I said to this labor leader, what were you being told by policy leaders in the US at that time? And he said that someone from the Clinton administration had come to him and said, don't worry, we know a lot of jobs are going to go abroad. We know there's going to be a lot of tech-based disruption, but you're going to get a lot of cheaper stuff in Walmart. And, you know, eventually wages are going to equalize around the world and it's all going to be good. And the labor leader said, well, how long is that going to take? And this economist, not an economist like you, Cristina, said 3 to 5 generations. And that says two things.
Caricatures don't really help.
They actually do help because it says two things. We still have, and this is happening, this is important because we have a pushback right now in the US, and I fear we never really left the neoliberal framework in Europe, where we think that as long as prices are going down and share prices are going up, everything is fine, and that is not the case. We need to move from a world that is just about efficiency to one that is about resiliency. Everyone should read Sandor's report. It's very, very important. The final question, and let me actually be a little bit optimistic right here, the final point. Europe actually has an amazing opportunity right now because there's a very good chance that during the Trump administration, we're going to get a major market correction in the US. You've already seen that begun to happen. The AI story, which has been very frothy and in my mind very suspect, is starting to be questioned. That actually speaks to the idea that bigger is not always better. Disruptions can happen from small players. They can come from anywhere. Capital is desperate to move actually out of the US market because it is too concentrated. It would love to move to Europe, but Europe has to present itself as an investable, cohesive opportunity. So maybe I'll stop there because that's something positive.
Wow. You said you were going with worse, so I'm glad you sort of lifted it a little bit. We'll return to all of that, and I share much of that. Let me turn to James. IMF in Europe. Of course, the IMF has an important role to play as an international body. Looking at what's happening in China, some of the, and everywhere. But I mean, I want to start by that question. There is a lot of concern, which has been described all morning and has come up in this panel about the surplus that China has, this massive surplus. Sander talked about it, which is a great big cloud looming over us because it's going to disgorge all of this huge amount of the export, the shock. So what is the vision from the IMF as to how this is going to potentially be pulled back? Is there pressure you can put on China to just absorb some of it internally in some way? What is the current view?
Thank you. So, and I appreciate Rana ending on a more positive note. I was going to say, so much gloom and doom. Maybe try to start with something positive, and then I'll turn to China. I think when we look at European policymaking over the past few years, I think we have to give a lot of credit to policymakers for the really swift and coordinated response to unprecedented shocks. So the pandemic, the gas shutoff, we've seen some actions that really were impressive and demonstrated some resilience. So hopefully that speaks to the ability to do difficult things and rise to meet challenges. I would say that all that said, over the medium term, we have a pretty subdued outlook for growth, so just a little bit over 1%. To say that the external environment is challenging may be an understatement based on everything we've heard. High energy costs, challenging demographics, spending pressures from aging, defense, climate. So there are a lot of things. I'd love to come back to that maybe after addressing the China point. So on China, the IMF has been stressing that China should rebalance its economy toward domestic consumption by strengthening the social safety net, should also by liberalizing the services sector, and scaling back distortive supply-side policies that support manufacturing sectors. So we are on record. You can see all these messages in our report from our annual report from 2024, looking at China's economy. Taking policy action to rebalance the economy would help China achieve more sustainable growth, and reforms that promote opening up of the service sector can help create jobs and lower unemployment. So this is really in China's interest, and we are making this case. We've been doing this for some time. So just we will be as persuasive as we can with our analysis. I think they should care. If you think, I mean, people have touched on a lot of the aspects here. We talk about the European model a lot, but if you look at, pardon me, China's model, it's been very heavily reliant on investment, domestic investment, real estate was mentioned, and exports. They may have hit the end of the road or getting close, right, in terms of what's going on in the real estate sector. So that has not they're facing a lot of challenges. Exports, you see some shift probably toward exports given what's going on in terms of domestic investment in real estate. As we've been discussing, this is not an easy time for exports, and I think there may be a difficult global environment. So from China's perspective, this would be good, right, to rebalance, have more sustainable growth, and growth that really benefits the population in terms of job creation. So I think we make the case. I just want to emphasize we are doing that, and I think we're on record.
This is a big question, of course, what China's been doing, and then for the benefit of everyone here, it shows that a serious industrial policy that is directed actually works, in that they have been able to achieve what they've been able to achieve in the last few years. That was in some ways unexpected, driving major inroads into Europeans' strongholds in terms of our capabilities. But now, James, to follow up on this, industrial policy is very much a theme of this panel, and there are sort of various views. We'll return to each and every one on this sort of the recipe. But the fundamental fact is that Europe has not been able to really design or implement anything as resembling a coherent industrial policy so far. So it's in discussion, but what's the IMF view as to what Europe should be doing in this area and how to achieve it?
Great, well, thanks. Let me start sort of on some of the bigger themes that we've been talking about, Draghi, et cetera. So we welcome the Draghi report, the letter report, the competitiveness compass released yesterday. I would say in particular, we welcome the emphasis on boosting productivity and innovation, including by completing the single market. This would really help address the key challenges that Europe is facing. So strengthening the single market, I want to say this is in the hands of European policymakers. It costs relatively little, and it would go a long way toward boosting growth and resilience in the context of a number of shocks, and as we've discussed, high uncertainty externally. I think watching the earlier panels, almost everybody has mentioned the single market. In terms of the Draghi report, we also agree on a role for EU-wide spending on delivering common public goods. So this could be R&D, this could be cross-border infrastructure, energy security is a key one, defense. I think we would argue for taking care in some areas to make sure you avoid questions about WTO consistency and contributing to global fragmentation. Let me say a little bit about the single market, and I come back to industrial policy. I'm not ignoring this point. So focusing a bit on productivity, if people haven't seen it, our regional economic outlook released in November really focuses on this. It does a deep dive looking at firm level productivity in Europe. And so relatively weak productivity growth has been behind Europe, really falling behind the US. And so this has been going on for about 2 decades. In the 90s, it was pretty comparable. Since the 2000s, we've seen Europe really falling behind. And now Europe is below the US, 30% below the US in terms of per capita income. So this is a pretty good sized gap. And if we did a long-term forecast, we don't see a prospect for this really narrowing. So what's behind this weaker productivity growth? When we do the analysis, two key factors stand out. Market size and financing. Financing is very important, and the IMF, we strongly support efforts to create a capital markets union. But let me focus on market size here. I think that would be a different panel to get into all the capital markets union issues. I think Sven Giegel did a good job of emphasizing, unfortunately, Europe is still very far from operating as a true single market. There are significant intra-EU barriers. So we did work to look at sort of what you would expect trade to be based on some fundamental factors, and then looking at what actual trade is. And so our estimates suggest that these barriers for intra-EU trade could be equivalent to a tariff of about 44% on average for goods trade, and this is about 3 times what you see in the US, between US states. And for services, the estimated tariff equivalent barrier is even higher at up to 110%. So these are really striking numbers. And I think what they show is how much more can be done and how much more needs to be done internally. And this action would yield significant benefits. So firms would have greater incentives to invest in a larger market, greater incentives to undertake R&D. And I would just note, so R&D public R&D is comparable when you look at the US and Europe. It's private R&D where US is much lower. And really it would also give incentives to scale up. So, and when we look at what it would mean, so our analysis suggests that if you could reduce intra-EU trade barriers to US levels, the direct impact on productivity would be 7 percentage points in the long term. So this is a huge, huge benefit. So what is needed to realize a better single market? This is improving cross-border infrastructure. This is liberalizing protected sectors, pardon me. Further liberalizing intra-EU trade and harmonizing regulations across member states. And we welcome the competitiveness compass, including an emphasis on enforcement. And this was mentioned by others earlier, that many things are done, but then you have gold plating, you have different standards. This is a real barrier for firms trying to operate across Europe. So I focused the most on trade, but let me just say one or two things quickly about the movement of people and capital as well, because these are very important for innovation and productivity. Just to give an example or two. So labor movement costs between EU countries are estimated to be 8 times higher than for moving between US states. Really, really significant difference. And then, we talk a lot about startups. So let me say something about venture capital. So venture capital can help support innovation, but Europe's venture capital investments are only a quarter of those in the US. And our research shows that venture capital injections lead recipient firms to double their intangible investments within a year. So a lot of this, I think, comes back to CMU as a really key element of completing the single market. So if these barriers to the flow of people and capital can be addressed, there'd be huge gains. And just to come back, these are all in the hands of European policymakers, and these are areas where they can take action that would support stronger growth and enhance resilience. And again, this is a time where we talk about external challenges. Do the things that can enhance resilience at home. All of this should be complemented by domestic structural reforms. Again, that's a deep topic. I won't get into all that now, but that would really boost the benefits. And so then let me finish on industrial policy, since you'd asked about that. So if industrial policy is used, it should be used in a smart and coordinated way. And I just want to note, industrial policy is definitely back on the table. So when we look at the numbers, state aid in EU countries now accounts for approximately 1.5% of EU GDP. And this is up an entire percentage point from a decade ago. So that's a pretty significant jump. So if industrial policy is considered, it should be forward-looking. I think Luis really made this point, rather than seeking to protect mature industries. And it should be coordinated at the EU level. It's incredibly important to be focused on addressing market failures where better policies are not available. So I think climate comes up as a good example of an externality where the market is not going to solve this problem. Government action is needed. It should be time-bound to contain fiscal costs. And it should be accompanied by a strong governance framework to avoid institutional capture. I think others have really touched on this. So coordination at the EU level is essential to reduce the risk of negative spillovers to other member countries, to avoid distorting trade, undermining comparative advantage, and disrupting production patterns in the single market. And so we've done some research. We had a few papers in the past year, and the director of our department did a speech in Vilnius in December highlighting some of this. So we found that unilateral industrial policies can be harmful even if they target externalities at the national level. But coordinating cuts losses from unilateral industrial policies by more than half for the average European country. And coordination can also help cushion the adverse impact on regions that might otherwise lose out. This could be through addressing these impacts through intra-EU fiscal transfers. And significantly lowering remaining internal barriers to labor and capital mobility could turn the losses you see from industrial policy into gains. So let me stop there. I've covered a lot, but I think industrial policy, there's a need to be careful, and if you do it, you really have to think about how you do it. Now, there's a lot of ways to go wrong, and it can be expensive.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And there's nothing like some numbers to really kind of make this predicament stuck. I just will rattle out some of the figures you gave, because I think people should really take them away. A 30% gap in GDP per head between the US and Europe developed over the last 20 years. We were converging and now we are like this. The internal market barriers are equivalent to tariffs of 44% between European countries, and if eliminated, this could give a boost to productivity of 7%. I mean, this is mind-boggling figures. Which, as you say, are in our hands. So the question, though, is, I think, of course, there is enthusiastic agreement that we should pursue the single market, pursue the capital market union, all of that. What's the timing for this to happen? Because that's a question that also applies to, of course, subsidies. But the sense is that the peril is very imminent and that we are looking over the edge of a precipice in some way. The industrialization is a very risky position. Where I said the Detroit moment in Germany, factories may close, unemployment may increase. You said on current trends, there is no real respite to the current situation. So, man, we can walk on our cobbled streets and go to the beach, but this is grim, I have to say. So I don't want to just be always so pessimistic. Let me turn to Thoersten, coming from inside the Ministry for Economic Affairs in Germany. You've been, of course, focused, of course, on the interface between industrial policy and or economic policy and competition policy. You've been very involved in that, but this is not exactly what you're going to be focusing on. Give us a perspective on this discussion from where you stand, and then I'll just open up to the rest of the club.
Cristina, thanks and congrats for the perfect timing, given that the EU Commission yesterday presented its competitiveness compass. On your question, what is the timing for measures? Now. Stéphane Séjourné, the Commissioner for Industrial Strategy yesterday said that the EU needs a shock therapy. Now, I will really focus on EU industrial policy and some of the design choices to be made. But as a German, let me upfront say two short points on Germany. On the dire diagnose Sander and others have presented, I'd say, I can clearly say we got it. We got the diagnose, and I'd say also people are already feeling it. On the therapy, the hope is that after the elections, we will see structural reforms coupled with additional investment through the use of fiscal space and at least some moderate easing of the debt brake. And for the German government, one key element to growth, obviously, is a well-designed industrial policy, both on a national and on the EU level. Now, how to design EU industrial policy? I will give you a couple of propositions. Number one, let's keep and strengthen two of our biggest geopolitical selling points, the green transformation and the internal market. We need to keep the EU also from a business perspective a leader in green tech. On the internal market, we need, has been said, for example, cross-border mergers. We need pan-European players to drive the political integration. Proposition number two, the focus should be more on horizontal than on vertical industrial policy. This is now not so much about German ordoliberal thinking in the sense that we should not pick winners. It's also not about money, because both horizontal and vertical policies can and will cost. In Germany, for example, in the election campaign, we have the discussion about across-the-board lowering of tax rates for firms versus investment incentives. Both horizontal measures, they will obviously cost. But the preference for horizontal measures is they will potentially help everyone and they will lift the spirit, and we need that. What horizontal measures? I think the obvious ones have already been mentioned. Cut red tape, slash bureaucracy, simplify, less reporting, speed up administrative procedures. the simplification omnibus in the competitive compass can only be a start. Second, unleash, and that has been said by Benoit before and by James now, we need to unleash money, European savings into firms and into venture capital through pension funds, insurances. We need the capital markets union, including savings and investment union. We need the 28th legal regime for firms. Proposition 3. If we do vertical industrial policy, it can still be to a significant extent on a national front, national action, national money, but we should coordinate better. That point has also been made. It's no secret that the German government has been advocating for extending the transition section of the temporary crisis and transition state aid framework to be able to put national money into the transition towards a net zero economy. At the same time, there is the openness to discuss the competitiveness coordination tool, whatever you call it, as has been suggested by the Commission yesterday, to just identify joint priorities, let's say, for example, for the car industry. We can also couple national with EU funding. That's also something that the EU Commission has proposed yesterday. Number 4, and I think Luis has already made that point. We have to be super clear in our analysis on the goals and priorities and trade-offs, in particular when choosing the sectors. We can only spend €1 once, and given our situation, we need the biggest long-term bang for our buck. So that we just have to be clear in what we do and also what we not do. There is, Luis said it, there is the growth agenda, there is economic security choke point agenda, there is military and cybersecurity agenda. There are interdependencies, of course, but they are different. We have to be clear on that. And if you then try to pin down priorities, also been said, there are sectors that are not competitive anymore, and we have not been very good at letting go players that are not competitive any longer. There are industries, car industry, probably prime example in Germany, with just lots of jobs. So it's easy to discuss that as an economist, but just also from a political and socio-economic point of view, and also given that the German car industry is still to some extent at the front, we need to do something. You have industries where we need reshoring, vaccines, and so on. We haven't touched that other topic. And then there are the industries with the future potential. There is analysis out there. Probably some of you have read this McKinsey Global Institute report on the next big arenas of competition. For those of you who know Harry Potter, they distinguish between muggles with entrenched business models on the one hand, and the wizards, the hyperscalers, the disruptors with the endogenous sunk cost, the network effects, the ever-improving nodes where you have the big prize for just being the number one and those who upend competition. And of course, Europe must take its chances to have the wizards. And there are those strengths. I'm not an expert there, but let's say in quantum, in biotech. Number 5, when we change existing or come up with a new regulation, we have to be big on big and small on small, or even don't do anything on small. Take the GDPR, that's, to say that clearly, my personal opinion. Commission has just suggested simplifying the record keeping yesterday. I don't know whether this one-size-fits-all approach is really makes sense. Number 6, if we have massive trade distortions, either subsidies or tariffs, we have to be coherent, and we also have to be united. Coherent, take the foreign subsidies regulation, and we have to make sure that when the EIB spends money, when we spend national money, that this money does not run counter to the logic of what we have adopted before. in the context of, let's say, Chinese projects. United, I'm pretty optimistic that the EU in the future will act here in a united way. Number 7, European preference has also been mentioned by Sander and proposed, but we need to do it and also by Louis. I think we need to do it in an administrable way. For state aid and the use of EU funds, it's obvious they should benefit the EU ecosystem. For public procurement, the Commission yesterday suggested introducing European preference for critical sectors and technologies. What I mean with administrable, if we circumscribe European preference, let's say using CO2 footprint, we just have to make sure that firms have the data and can be part of the tender, because it doesn't make sense. That's then really a competition issue. And maybe my final point on competition policy, it needs to take into account current realities. In soccer and football terms, if you play too aggressive and play your defense too high, you are in the danger of being overrun. So I think we really we have to think about twisting and tweaking competition policy to some extent. The German government has made a number of proposals. What we definitely need is more emphasis on innovation, on certainty for cooperation. And my final point, and what we don't need to do is to politicize relevant markets. I think Andreas Mons has said nothing in the Draghi report actually was compromising competition policy. There was actually one sentence saying that for telco markets, we need them on a European level. I would disagree with that. Final point on competition, and I think that's one of the most important ones. Antitrust, DMA and DSA decisions, this is not only about some economics, this is about defending our democracy, our sovereignty, and I would really urge our enforcer colleagues to take this reality into account. This is given our values, but also strategically looking into what will be the upcoming negotiations. We should not be triggered. We should look through the noise. We should stay calm and double down.
Thank you. I'll stop you there. I want to give the last opportunity to other panelists to go back to. Sander, you want to say a couple of things? Just literally a minute, because I think everyone is desperate for coffee, and there's been a lot of content in this discussion.
No, I can be very, very brief. I think there's both too much optimism on this panel on horizontal policies and too much pessimism on sectoral policies. The China shock is a demand shock. You can deregulate all you want. I don't even disagree. And I think James's points were fantastic. I mean, the work they're doing on the single market, wonderful. Nobody disagrees. But if there's no demand for our industry, nothing will happen. New sectors wizards don't just magically pop out of the ground, out of nowhere. That will take years. So I would be a bit careful with the idea that we can use horizontal and single market policies to counter what is a very specific demand shock for our most productive sectors, as a matter of fact. My first point. My second point is new and old sectors are completely related. Where did ASML come from? Our most promising tech company. It came from Philips. It came from an existing company.
There is path dependency.
Which country in the world is the second largest producer of EVs? Didn't come from a garage, but it's Germany. It is the German firms, existing firms doing it. So guys, I mean, watch out before you put away the crown jewels. I think Europe is showing clear strength still in automotive. We're leading in aerospace, or in civil aviation rather. We're leading in machine building. If you don't put demand into those industries, they may wither, and it will be very costly for us. And it will also cost us future wizards. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great point. Luis, let me just briefly challenge you on one point. You are not in favor of the idea of, for example, procurement rule that direct companies to buy European. You think that that's effectively not what should be done, and it will increase complication and so on. But what about sectors, and I think about the digital sector, which I know well, in which we are completely lacking a digital European infrastructure because everyone buys AWS, everyone buys Microsoft, and we have capabilities in Europe to supply some of our own demand. It's only that everybody goes because it's like buying IBM. And the European cloud industry is shrinking while it is there. So what is so wrong with the idea of introducing by European rules? The rest of the world does it, by American, by Chinese. Why is it so undesirable?
I think that, I mean, my problem with all these specific rules, and also with what Rana's argument was put by a Chicago economist. I'm a Chicago economist, by the way, Chicago PhD. So Harold Dempsey, he talked about the nirvana fallacy. The nirvana fallacy is someone who sees a market problem, sees the market failure, we all see it, we say, yeah, there's a market failure, and then imagines some wonderful bureaucrat who does industrial policy that is coordinated, forward-looking, doesn't defend existing politics, blah, blah, blah. That's not how the world works, right? There are two sides with failures, and we want to look at both. Now, in terms of buy European, I mean, we, in the particular instance you said, AWS, etc., that's one good example where we have a very sophisticated kind of infrastructure that is put there. I think we need to make sure we preserve our values in terms of Digital Service Act and so on, and avoid people kind of controlling our debate. But as long as the rules are fulfilled, we should take advantage of whatever is cheap and out there. I wouldn't kind of try to kind of do this long shot to try to get. I don't see the need to do that. And now, however, in general terms, Cristina, I buy some of the European rules when we're talking about subsidies, right? If we're giving a subsidy to somebody, we could say, look, the electric car subsidies should go for electrical companies. I can see the rules of that.
Very good. Johannes, any last 1 minute?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think the key challenge is to how to be selective and how to be clear about what we want to achieve. And my criticism is that on the one hand, some of the simplification debate is about really rolling back the green transition, but dressing this as simplification. And the other point is, to what extent the resilience point that Rana has made is the other key objective, namely that we need to be resilient and stand up for our interests. And the key point is to have the governance where you really have that squeezed out of what is the objectives we want to achieve. And I think that's where the Commission has shied off so far in making these difficult choices. And this is what both the Council, the Commission and the Parliament have to come up.
Thank you. Rana, I'll give you the final word. Just at the end of this panel, do you think still it's worse? Are you slightly more optimistic, or do you still think we are just in the benign area of managed decline?
Look, I think there are huge challenges. There's huge challenges. We've heard a lot about them. I guess my final word is, don't forget people. Don't forget individual voters, individual workers. I mean, that's the thing, I'm sorry to say, the Chicago school did forget. It was considered a negative externality, global warming, labor strife. These things happen in the real world. We have to account for them. And our government's role, wherever we are, is to mitigate. And to help make markets fair and to help them operate in the public interest. And I think Europe is in a great position because of its values and because of its history to now lead that conversation if it has the courage.
Wonderful. And on the dot at 11:30, I think I will now release you, although you didn't pay any notice to what I said earlier. Now you can go and have coffee. I deserve it too. And please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Thank you so much.